Trump is the president now, and he has an economic plan that doesn't make any sense whatsoever, and that's what I'm going to break down for you in 3 steps. Each step will compound on top of the next. If you like this video, subscribe and give it a like. The goal here is to, obviously I'm an insufferable neoliberal Democrat, but perhaps people on both sides will see what I have to say and say, I don't fully agree on everything, but he's a straight shooter and he's consistent, and maybe you'll learn something. Or you can just call me a slur like so many on TikTok do. But let's begin. Step 1. Trump is doing tariffs, and he's applied a 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada and a 10% tariff on China, and soon he'll be announcing tariffs on the EU. This is a truly terrible idea. So off the bat, it's worth saying that a 25% tariff on imported goods is just a 25% sales tax. In Trump's first term, he levied tariffs on things like aluminum, and that's not really something you could buy at the store, but it's in our products, so it raised our prices. And this ended up being one of the largest tax increases in American history, so big that it offset his entire 2017 tax cut. 2 years ago, I was on a plane back from DC, and I sat next to an executive at Coors, and being the annoying individual I am, I insisted on talking to him, and he told me about the time he met with Trump in the Oval Office about the aluminum tariff, and then he very firmly told me why he thinks Peter Navarro is, quote, a fucking asshole. If you don't know who that is, Peter Navarro was Trump's trade guy in the first term, and then he went to jail, and now he's back to being Trump's trade guy. It's like the circle of life in the Trump world. So on this plane, he gave me the whole rundown. Coors Brewing created the first all-aluminum 2-piece can, which is our modern-day can. So the body is made with a single piece of aluminum, and then the second piece is the top. Before this, beer and soda and other carbonated beverages were in steel cans, and these were heavy and expensive to produce and ship, but aluminum is very light and it's very cheap and perfectly recyclable, which is why it's still the industry standard 70 years later. So Coors purchases 500 million pounds of aluminum every year, and the U.S. only produces around 2 billion pounds a year, which if Coors was the only company that existed, that's totally enough. But Coors isn't the only company that exists. Other beer companies exist too, and I know my uncle might not believe it, but other drinks exist too. We also build planes, appliances, we do construction, so there simply isn't enough aluminum to go around. Those who support tariffs say that they're supposed to make you buy local, but there's not even enough American aluminum to go around, so all you're doing is just raising the price on yourself and getting no return on it. Now, Trump wants to do this across the board on everything, and I get why, and I think tariffs can be good in critical sectors to protect our own industry in things like semiconductors, batteries, and medical products. But that's not what most Americans are importing from China. They're importing products like furniture, bedding, games, toys. You get the idea. This is stuff you buy on Amazon. So I guess I would ask, is this low-wage manufacturing economy what we want? The reason these items are cheap is because it's using low-wage manufacturing in developing nations. Do Americans want those jobs, or do they want those jobs at American wages? American workers get paid American wages, and therefore the price of the goods they make is substantially higher. Ice trays are $10 on Amazon right now, and the majority of these were made in China. The average factory worker in China is paid $13,000 a year. That kind of wage is illegal in the United States. But if you take the average U.S. wage for manufacturing, which is about $52,000 a year, that ice tray is now $40. I know the conventional talking point is that they'll pay more for products in America, but I don't think that's true. No, you won't. Who wants a $40 ice tray? It better make its own water at that price. We definitely can't export these either. No one's going to buy it. I should also note, yet the Chinese ice tray under Trump's 10% blanket tariff on China is $11, still significantly cheaper than the American-made tray. So it doesn't make much sense to bring ice tray manufacturing here, so they won't. But we're still going to pay higher prices for them regardless, and over the long term, consume less. And since we're consuming less, we're getting less investment. It's completely and totally nonsensical. There's this thing about Trump, though. It's like he's a figment of our imaginations, and everyone just projects their desires onto him. I'm guilty of this too. I still have this nagging feeling in me that he'll increase aid to Ukraine because he wants to seem strong and be the man who defeated Russia. All evidence says that I'm delusional, but you can't deny that this is what everyone does with him. So if you like him and you just realize that these tariffs don't make sense, you're probably saying, well, he won't do that, he's going to do something else that makes sense, or he's using them for leverage, or he's doing negotiations, whatever. And I hope you're right. But let's talk about why Trump thinks that tariffs work. He's a mercantilist who believes that countries get rich by accumulating money. So he believes it's good to export, aka foreigners give you money, and bad to import, aka you give foreigners money. And tariffs are a perfect tax because they raise revenue while deterring people from engaging in the bad activity of giving money to foreigners. In 2016, he and Navarro explained this by writing, "When net exports are negative, that is, when a country runs a trade deficit by importing more than it exports, this subtracts from growth." So in English, they said that the less you import, the higher GDP is. And that's just not true. Imports are foreign goods, but they're also raw materials, machinery, and components that businesses rely on produce finished goods domestically. The best example of this is the iPhone. Apple designs all of the components. They are created overseas and then brought back to the US to be sold, or then shipped to the rest of the world to sell. You toss a tariff on that, and now Apple's making iPhones that cost $3,000 and are very hard to obtain because you're increasing costs and limiting their access to materials. Not only have you limited your own consumption, but you've also lowered global consumption of your goods, so now you're not making any money. There are two other things I want to mention, though, before step 2. In Trump's first term, when tariffs were applied to foreign washing machines, American-made washing machines also increased their price to match the new imported price, because economically, they made more money matching the price rather than being cheaper than the imported machines. This happened with inflation as well. Prices increased beyond what inflation actually was because companies saw they could and everyone would blame inflation. You're just increasing prices while not actually protecting your own industry. The second thing is, if you follow international news, you know this, but for whatever reason, domestic news glosses over it. Tariffs go both ways. Canada, China, and Mexico will respond with tariffs on us. So now it becomes harder for us to export. It really creates this spiral. And I want to read you this thing from FDR because he has this really great quote from his 1932 campaign for president on these tariff battles. For example, our next door neighbor Canada imposed retaliatory tariffs on your peaches so that their tariff is now higher than the freight rates to Canada. And there is a retaliatory tariff on asparagus and on other vegetables and other fruits, so high that practically none of your agricultural products can be sold to your logical neighbors. Your neighbors across the border. The market for your surplus is destroyed, and thereby fair prices for your whole crop are made impossible.
This is Humphrey Bogart. I'm a registered voter in the 16th Congressional District of California. I'm one of a number of people from a great many walks of life who've come here tonight of our own free will because we have a deep and common interest in the outcome tomorrow of the most important election in this history of our country. I'm voting for Franklin D. Roosevelt because I think he's one of the world's greatest humanitarians, and because he's leading our fight against the enemies of a free people in a free world. Millions of other people are for him for the same reason, or perhaps very different reasons.
Step 2. Trump says he's going to do the largest mass deportation in American history. I understand that immigration is an issue that generates a lot of passion, but the answer to whether or not this is wise is pretty straightforward. If we assume that Trump succeeds with the tariffs and now all manufacturing is back in the United States, we're going to have a lot of jobs open. Like a lot of jobs. And right now the United States is already at full employment. It varies by month and quarter, but the past few years we've had it, or we've been pretty close to it. Full employment, though, it doesn't mean 0% unemployment. It just means that almost everyone who wants a job can find one, but it leaves room for short-term transitions and structural issues like maybe a skills mismatch or geographic disparities. So right now, there are about 162 million people employed, and currently there are about 8 million open jobs and around 7 million unemployed people. And for people from 25 to 54, the workforce participation rate is near 85%. The other 15% aren't lying around waiting for jobs. They may be raising children, taking care of older family members, or maybe a family member with a disability. They could also be in school, or maybe they have health issues themselves. But the point I'm making here is that every American who we would traditionally expect to be working is working, and every American who wants to work can get a job. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics does count undocumented people in these statistics. So when we talk about mass deportations, it's important to keep this in mind. Undocumented people account for 5% of the workforce and around 8 million workers, and that's a lot. If they had their own state, it would be the 13th largest in the country. And they're not spread evenly across the economy. They're very focused into specific industries. 26% of workers in agriculture, forestry, and fisheries are undocumented. There are also 17% of the construction workforce, 15% of hospitality, 15% of meat packing, just to name a few. These are not fun jobs. They pay low wages, and they're physically demanding, and the conditions aren't that great. If Americans wanted these jobs, more Americans would work them. But clearly, Americans don't want these jobs, and that's why there's room for undocumented people to do so. So if Trump does deport all 8 million workers, there's going to be shortages in grocery stores. Farms are warning of crop yields decreasing by 20% or even more. With less food to go around, prices will increase. You'll see similar impacts when it comes to meat packing and manufacturing. Service will get worse in hotels and restaurants, and construction projects will stall. That's just the impact you will see and realize first, but the consequences go all the way downstream. Undocumented workers are people. I know our political discourse forgets this, but they are people like you and me, and they pay rent, they buy things, they go out to eat, they are part of the communities, they have kids in the community. So rental units will sit empty. Businesses will lose customers, and with lower revenues, they'll have to cut back on employees, and so now Americans are unemployed as well. We actually know this is exactly how it goes because Florida passed a law that cracked down on unauthorized workers in the state, and it's been a failure for them. The majority of farm workers in Florida were undocumented, and now anywhere between 10 to 20% of crops go unharvested, and that's just because a lot of them haven't left yet. But if more do leave and are forced to leave, Florida could be looking at 30 to 50% of labor-intensive crops, like strawberries, being unharvested. Inflation is going to be nuts. But look, maybe Ron DeSantis envisions Americans going out there to pick oranges, and there is a wage that Americans will pick oranges at, but I'm fairly certain that Americans don't want to buy these oranges that Americans will be picking. But you know, the other issue here is that there's not actually anyone who can come pick the oranges. Trump and MAGA talk like there's a secret group of unemployed people who are going to fill all these jobs, and that secret group just doesn't exist. So we already have 8 million open jobs, but now with undocumented deportations, we now have 16 million open jobs and still only 7 million Americans. A part of Trump's plan is to try to cut legal immigration by at least 50%, and every year a million people enter the U.S. through legal channels. So when you cut that down, it's 50,000 a year. I would also say keep in mind that in Trump's vision, he somehow also got the tariffs to work. So now we have a ton of factory jobs here now in the United States as well. Although I should note that America lost over 250,000 jobs from the tariffs in his first term. But assuming he's a wizard, and maybe he is, and it works, who is working these jobs? We don't have the people. We're just going to be producing less and consuming less as a nation, which is not a good economic plan. It's nonsensical. I guess the solution to this lack of workers problem could be to cut Social Security, which is something that Elon and Mike Johnson talk a lot about. Republicans have been trying to cut Social Security since at least the second Bush administration. There are 50 million retirees out there, and the majority of them are over 70. If you cut their Social Security, you could get about 75% of retirees to work again because the alternative is poverty. They could go work in fields or factories or construction until they die. But is that really what we want? I don't doubt my 84-year-old grandpa's ability to pick oranges, but after giving 60 years to the fire department, army, and phone company, should he really be doing this? Trump throws around these ideas of tariffs and mass deportations very willy-nilly, and I'm just asking for a little bit of honesty of what they entail when it comes to discussing them, because we're only on step 2, and we're already in a full-fledged economic crisis.
I'll offer anybody here $50 an hour if you'll go pick lettuce in Yuma this season and pick for the whole season. So, okay, sign up, okay. When you sign up, and you'll be there for the whole season, okay? Not just one day, because you can't do it, my friend.
Step 3. In step 1, Trump raised prices. In step 2, he shrunk the workforce. Two things that are inflationary. In step 3, we're cutting taxes while raising spending, but before we get there, let's review. America's fiscal trajectory is nearing a death spiral as interest on the national debt grows as a share of the federal budget. In fiscal year 2025, interest payments alone account for 13% of total federal spending. That's a sobering figure, and the stakes are clear. If the United States cannot adjust its fiscal policies, the consequences could be catastrophic. For years, the conventional wisdom has been that debt isn't an urgent concern because GDP typically grows faster than debt. This logic worked during the Obama years when interest rates hovered near zero, keeping borrowing costs negligible. But the era of zero interest rates is over. The Federal Reserve's current interest rate is at 4.5%, and when you're carrying $36 trillion in debt, 4.5% represents an enormous and growing burden. Unlike in previous decades, debt growth now regularly outpaces GDP growth, forcing policymakers to grapple with the long-term sustainability of federal spending. I think the shift in interest rates demands a reassessment of how we approach deficits and debt. Ironically, when rates were near zero, Republicans were fixated on reducing the deficit. Obama and congressional Democrats, eager to neutralize GOP criticisms, prioritized deficit reduction. Then Trump took office and the fiscal playbook flipped. Republicans who had railed against debt embraced large tax cuts while increasing spending, expanding the national debt by 33% in just 4 years, matching Obama's debt increase over 8 years. Biden, while not exactly a deficit hawk, added debt more modestly by only 16%. If you're new to this, the deficit and the debt are two different things, but they're related. The deficit is the federal government's annual shortfall when it spends more than it collects in revenue, while the debt is the total accumulation of those yearly deficits. Today's $36 trillion in national debt is a result of decades of deficits fueled by tax cuts, mandatory spending growth, and more recently, pandemic relief measures. So the U.S. debt problem isn't just a product of bad decision-making, it's driven by structural changes. Two forces dominate: an aging population and rising healthcare costs. As baby boomers retire, Social Security and Medicare costs soar, while the workforce paying into those programs shrinks. Simultaneously, healthcare spending continues to grow faster than the overall economy. Policy choices have compounded these challenges. The Bush tax cuts of the early 2000s and Trump's 2017 tax cuts reduced federal revenues substantially, contributing to today's $36 trillion debt. Trump's fiscal approach was uniquely reckless, combining tax cuts with spending increases during a period of economic growth, a moment when fiscal restraint should have been the priority. Ideally, you would do deficit spending during down times and you would cut back spending during good times. That's how it used to work, but it hasn't since 2017. But this year represents a brand new opportunity to stop the spiral into the great unknown because the Trump tax cuts expire. We have a rare opportunity to recalibrate fiscal policy. Now, unfortunately for all of us, there's not going to be a recalibration. They're looking to not only expand on the Trump's tax cuts and make them deeper, they're also trying to make them permanent. They have tried to distract from this with Elon and their government efficiency agency, who says they're going to cut $2 trillion from the federal budget this year. And the budget is about $7 trillion, so they're going to cut 30% of spending. But here's what you need to know. That's not happening. They're not getting anywhere close to that number. 75% of the budget is mandatory spending. The other 25% covers things like veterans, healthcare, highways, air traffic control, the National Weather Service, social services, the justice system, paying soldiers, funding military research, and a lot of other things. This kind of thing, a committee to identify waste or to balance the budget, has been tried a lot, and they all fail because while waste exists, like charging a lot for toilets or screws on government contracts, it just doesn't really add up to a meaningful amount. Elon has proposed cutting air traffic controllers, and if you want to do that, be my guest, but you're going to own the plane crashes and collisions that follow. The fact of the matter is that the U.S. government is huge, and it's a huge provider of services, and it's a huge part of the economy. It's the country's largest employer, and there's not much you can cut from it without hurting a lot of people. Whether that's the recipients of the services you're cutting, like veterans healthcare, or the providers of said services. If it was easy, we wouldn't have this level of debt. And look, right now, Trump is impounding federal spending. This is illegal. It failed in court at least 5 times this week. And I know they're ignoring the court order and are still freezing spending. I think this is bad, but eventually these funds will be freed because the alternative is what? He gets impeached? Maybe I have too much faith in Congress, though. The first time around, Republicans justified the tax cuts because they believed that the country was still growing and that we weren't actually at full employment. It's a valid theory of taxation. You cut taxes, but you know that you're going to be taxing more people. But it's not 2017 anymore. I know it feels like yesterday, but that was 8 years ago. And we had low inflation and low interest rates, and the prime age employment population ratio was well below historic norms. Today, none of that is true. On top of that, Trump is shrinking the workforce. He's limiting the amount of people coming in and kicking out undocumented workers who pay taxes but don't get any of the services back. And then he's cutting taxes dramatically on the rich, and he's not taxing tips, and he's getting rid of the income tax. All of that's to say it's probably not advisable to take policy steps that increase the long-term budget deficit. I know Elon's solution is that we just don't pay our debt, but look, don't hate me. Don't hate me. Don't call me a partisan. I guess I am partisan, but don't. You know, I'm being very sincere when I'm about to say he is such a moron about things that aren't rockets or electric cars. And I wish he would just be Rocket Man and not government coup man. Anyways, I'm not the only one who thinks this Trump three-step plan here doesn't make sense. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget has his plan increasing the deficit on average by nearly $8 trillion. The election is over, so who cares about Kamala Harris? But to provide an idea of what different realities look like, Harris's plan only increased it by $4 trillion. So there you have it. Trump's economic plan broken down in 3 steps, each one compounding the damage of the last. In step 1, tariffs raised prices for everyone. In step 2, mass deportations shrank the workforce and disrupted entire industries. And in step 3, we're cutting taxes while increasing spending, pushing the country further into a fiscal spiral. Now, people have asked me, if his concept is so stupid, why hasn't anyone told him? And my answer is, they have. Trump doesn't care that it doesn't work. He knows it polls well, and he insists against all evidence to the contrary that his presence in the White House will miraculously change how the world works. And that's just not true. If I had to guess how the next 4 years are going to go, this is what I would say. I think number 1, he continues the tariffs, then he makes up a fake deal and he says the imaginary problems he created have been solved and he removes the tariffs, or he'll say he applied tariffs and then just not apply the tariffs. On deportations, he's said that he deported a lot of people in his first term, but he deported them at a slower pace than Obama. I think he'll see success early on, but I think public blowback and the lack of funding for ICE will bring a stop to it. On spending, they're going to do what they did last time, cut taxes and raise spending. It's not ideal, but if he fails on tariffs and deportations, it's not too bad. So subscribe, comment, like, share, and if you want more of me, I don't know why you would, but I do a podcast with Preston Stewart called Unclassified. Give it a listen. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.